Hello and welcome back. This is the third part of the series, and it's a really interesting one because I'm going to be talking about the production of a mini documentary I recently made. I made a previous episode running through the pre-production, so if you want to check out some of the backstory and things like that, please check out that one. But this one's quite interesting because I just had a day and a half to film the entire thing, which is pretty limited. So the person who I was documenting, Glen, who I've mentioned in the other videos, he was only available for a day and a half. So we just had this quite limited time to film it. So I'm going to talk through what I did, some of the challenges, some of the things I learnt, and hopefully it's useful for someone else out there as well. So the first day I dedicated mainly to the interview. So a sit down interview with Glen where we're going to talk through and hopefully reveal some of the story elements with him through an interview. So the main focus of that day was just to get that absolutely nailed because that's the main structure we were going to use to base the documentary around. There's some other shots as well, which I'll get into as well. I should mention it ended up just being me and Glen on the entire shoot. So it was just myself shooting it, lighting it and doing all the sound and everything. So I really found it difficult to capture any behind the scenes. I've got a couple of things that I'll put up on the screen, which I did manage to capture. But yeah, apologies, I just couldn't get any more because I was so busy trying to concentrate on actually creating the video. So the interview takes place in a garden studio. I decided on this location. It's one of his neighbours' studios in their garden. Been to scout it and I'd figured out kind of the angles before. I cover more of that in the pre-production video if you want to find out more about that. The space we were shooting in was actually someone else's studio. So one of the first things we wanted to do was make it look a bit more authentic to Glen, to the person we're interviewing. And I'd already planned in the pre-production to bring in some different props and things which were relevant to the story that Glen was going to tell and to some of the images and things which we're going to show. For example, there's Super 8 footage which is discussed during the film. So I have a little Super 8 camera. We also had some actual props that Glen was going to need to discuss and look through. So we had those available. And we went into Glen's actual studio in his own house and we took out some books and things that actually belonged to him to make it a bit more personal and feel more like, or as I said, authentic to Glen. In the pre-production as well, I'd already identified that adding some little hats and things like that in. Now, in the stories that Glen's told, there's quite a lot of reference to different hats and things. So I thought that was a nice touch to add those in and create this environment for him to have his interview in that kind of made it all a bit more cohesive. And I also really like the idea of little references and little things that if you watch something multiple times, you'll notice that the next time through, or little nods to stuff that are discussed or shown in the film. And I thought it was a nice way to make a whole sort of little environment for the interview and also just make it feel a bit more personal to Glen. So in terms of more of the technical side of things and setting up the lighting, the cameras and that kind of stuff, for this interview, we're working in quite a compact space. It was really compact. It was almost like a sort of small shed type building. I'd already been to scout to see it during the pre-production stages, so I knew what I was working with, but it was still quite challenging on the day. In terms of the setup, I had a 2-camera setup. I had one camera on a wider shot to get more of an environmental portrait to capture those elements I mentioned. And then I had one coming in slightly more from the side at a closer angle to capture more of the emotions or cut to and add a bit more variety to the shots. So I spent a bit of time framing these up. I don't remember the exact focal lengths, but I think the wide was on about a 24 and then the sort of side close-up was on a 35mm lens for anyone who's interested. And then in terms of the lighting, I was a bit limited, A, because of the space, and B, I also didn't want to really overlight it or do any really convoluted lighting. And I wanted to sort of try and blend in with the natural light that was in there, but just add a little bit of pop, if you like, just to bring Glen out of the background a bit. And also because the interview might go on for some time, it's good to sort of light it and have at least some consistent light across Glen as the day goes on and the evening went on. So to do that, I tried a few different options. I tried softboxes and these kind of things. But I settled on bouncing it off of a bleached muslin cloth. So I just had a light pointed up and bouncing off into a sort of hung up bleached muslin cloth. I've got a video where I discuss making some of these fabrics. So I actually use one of the ones I discussed that I made in a previous video. I can link that below as well if you want to check out how I made those. And I used that just to bounce the light off, and that seemed to give a nice sort of clean, softish kind of light. Looking at it again, I'd probably maybe try to soften it even more, try shooting through, or maybe I needed a more powerful light to do that. But I sort of settled on this and I thought it looked quite good. And I didn't want to spend much more time on it because I'd already spent a lot. And I think it looks really nice and it blends in quite nicely with the actual natural light through the windows in the studio, while also, like I said, adding a little bit of pop. In terms of the camera angles, I've shot slightly from the shadow side, a classic thing to do in cinematography. So from both angles, they're just slightly to the shadow side. And so we've got a bit of definition and depth on Glen's face. So that's in terms of the sort of lighting and things. That's really all there was in the interview shot. Kept it quite simple, but I quite liked that. I did lots of fine tuning of the levels just until I figured what looked right and what I was happy with. But overall, that's the main setup that I used. One other thing I forgot, which ties into the lighting, but also ties into the audio, which I didn't mention. When I set up the audio, I was recording the main audio on a shotgun mic, so obviously just placed just above Glen, just out of frame, getting it as close as I can without it being in the shot. And then I also had a lav mic, which I'd put on him on his chest. I'd done a tape sandwich to stick that onto Glen, and we had him all mic'd up with a recorder beforehand. That mic was my backup mic, so the lav was my backup mic, and my main mic was the shotgun mic. And one thing that I did, which I like doing quite often, is I hung up a sound blanket on the one side of Glen. This was firstly to reduce some of the echo and reverb. It was a really reverby studio. I mean, I was never going to get perfect audio in there, but I just wanted to improve the reverb a bit. But also I doubled that up as a negative fill, so it's a bit of black material. I think I've got a behind the scenes, which I'll show. So during the pre-production, and when I'd first kind of imagined the interview setup, I knew I wanted to do that kind of more golden hour, late afternoon. I thought that would tie in nicely and have a nice sort of nostalgic feel that we wanted for this interview setup and for the documentary. So I knew I needed to film that later in the day, but we just got all of that setup that I just mentioned done earlier in the day. So that was the first thing we sort of did, was set dress the interview section, get the 2 cameras set up, get all the settings dialed in, get the lighting set up, and then get the audio blanket that I mentioned, the acoustic blanket, and the microphones, and make sure the levels of things are perfect. And then we just left that and had it all ready and set aside. I had my tripods set up and marked them out where they were. And then while that was being done, we went and filmed some of the other shots we needed. So I had this on my shot list on my schedule that I'd made. And we had some different shots inside Glen's house where he's viewing some projected slide images. So we gathered some of those and some different behind the scene ones while we were waiting for the right time of day. So it did require a bit of organization. I didn't stick perfectly to the shot list. We had to change some bits here and there, but it did help to give this really good structure for the day. And I was able to quickly check which bits I'd missed or which I could leave or which I could come back to on the second day of filming, which I'll discuss later in this video. So basically being organized and knowing when I was going to film the interview and getting it all set up and ready. So we just had to kind of go in and hit record essentially and just do some fine adjustments to it before really helped, because then we knew that was set up and we could just focus on that later. And I also wanted it to be a really calm environment when we were doing the interview. So I didn't want to be fiddling around with camera settings or worrying about that. I wanted to just make it more conversational. So making sure that was all set up early and ahead of time was really useful. And I think it really helped with the interview later on. And so in terms of conducting the actual interview, now I'm not really experienced as an interviewer, so this is relatively new for me. But I'd done quite a lot of preparation with questions I knew I wanted, but I just had these either memorized or I had them on some notes to fall back on. But I really wanted to avoid just having a sort of list of questions out that I was going to be just reading off of, because I think it would completely destroy, firstly, the sort of connection with Glen when I'm trying to interview him and keeping it conversational and allowing him to open up and feel comfortable. I feel like it would get quite static quite quickly if I'm just essentially sort of teleprompting, if you like, a load of questions. But I did memorize some to guide the story to try and get certain points across, but also to allow enough breathing space for Glen to actually just express himself. The actual interview ended up going on for around an hour and a half, and it did get quite emotional at some points. Now, it is good for it to get emotional because that's why people watch documentaries, but I always feel there's a bit of a balance between making sure the subject is really comfortable, and also you don't want to be exploitive either of trying to just get certain emotions out of someone for your documentary. So we did have some more emotional moments because we were talking about Glen's childhood and some of his memories and these kind of things. So it was really kind of delicate balance of keeping it conversational, trying to get the story points we wanted, but also knowing when to sort of not push any further or giving Glen some space, or even we needed to take a break partway through the interview. Because you've got to remember, you're always dealing with a human here. I mean, that's the most exciting and interesting thing about the documentary. And I really loved doing the interview, and it just felt like a conversation with friends. But you just got to be really careful, I think, not to kind of cross that border of being exploitive and just trying to push certain things out of people just to get your film how you want it. At least that's how I feel about it. So with the interview, I had some questions just to start it off. I let Glen talk through his own story as he wanted to tell it. And initially it was more almost like the bits he'd rehearsed or wanted to say. And then later on, kind of asked some more questions to, unlock some different bits about it, or just bits I was genuinely interested in, or things I thought the viewer might be interested to know more about as well. And then later on, I did have a little quick look when we were having a break at some of the questions I'd prepared, and we asked some of those as well. So it was definitely a bit of a blend. I feel like that worked quite well, but I'll always be trying to think about how I can improve my interviewing next time as well. Now, like I mentioned as well, one thing that happened was Glenn did get quite emotional during part of the interview. And later on, I did check with him that that was all right. And he said he was happy for that to be used. And I did check several days after, once maybe the emotions had set off and maybe the thrill of doing a documentary and things, just to make sure he's definitely happy with that. Because I think you should always respect the person that you're interviewing as well, and to make sure they're comfortable with what you're going to be putting out there onto the video. So I just did that and followed up, and he was happy. But I think that's always good as well, just to make sure that the person's comfortable and they're happy with how they're coming across and they don't feel exploited or anything like that. So it was quite a long day. We shot the interview, ended up going for about an hour and a half, but I think we needed 2 hours in total with the break. And then also we did some shots later in the evening, and that went on quite late. And we were both really, really knackered by then. And we decided to call it a day or call it an evening. And I came back later. We decided, I think it was about a week later, to come back and do the second part of the filming. What I did in between that was I actually got in contact with one of my friends, and he said he would help to edit the video, which I actually think is really good. And I'm going to talk more about the editing and the post-production in the next video. But basically, we had a little review of the footage we did get from the interview and some of the shots I got. And we realized, although the interview was good and we got a really solid, nice interview, and I felt like it went really well, and I'd done all of the technical aspects I needed to. But what was really missing was just capturing Glen himself as a person in more candid shots, or more actually, if you like, documentative shots of, him around his house and getting to sort of see his personality a bit more and the different sides of his personality as well. So I just decided that's between me and the editor, we decided that's where we should focus next. So when I returned, I just mic'd him up with a lav mic again, and I just shot again. So I had a lav mic, had a shotgun mic on the camera, and I was using a cine saddle. I can talk about that in another video if people aren't aware what that is, but it's basically just like a big beanbag sort of thing that you can wear to hold the camera. And I just used that to capture them all around the house. We had some different things with some of the story elements we were going to talk about. And we even had a really fun, slightly spontaneous moment where we went and set up a projector and things in the garden. And during that, I was able to catch a lot more of Glen's personality and some more candid shots. And I think these ended up just really being nice. And I actually really enjoyed filming those. I probably enjoyed those more than the interview. The interview I really liked, and it was a bit more technical in terms of lighting and stuff, but it was a lot of pressure as well. I felt like until we had that interview and all the main story elements, I couldn't really relax. Whereas on the second day of shooting, when I returned to Glen's, I was able to relax and get these real shots. And there was lots of really nice, actual organic moments. There was some where we slightly staged them, things like capturing Glen laughing, making a cup of tea or coffee in his house. His wife appeared in one of the shots while doing some gardening, and these kind of things that you couldn't really plan for. And I think that was really one of my favorite parts of the whole experience, was just quickly capturing some of these shots or being recording and happening to, capture these sort of fun little moments of real life. And I really think it helped to add a bit more character and a bit more depth to the interview, to the documentary, and to, like I said, to show Glen's personality. And really, that was really great to do that. But overall, I really, really enjoyed sort of the production side of it and shooting it. And it's been a real honor just to be able to tell a small section of Glen's life, to share this quite intimate story, quite emotional story. And it was really nice just hanging out with him. Like I said, he's a friend of mine, so we're kind of just hanging out together and making this video and sharing his story. And that was really brilliant. And I'll talk more about the editing in the next video, which my friend took care of, but I'll also discuss the post-production in terms of the color grading, which I did as well. But I hope you found this video on the production useful. Please feel free to comment below if you've got any other questions or I might have missed anything. So thank you so much for checking this video out, and I'll join you again very soon.